All right, we are now on to accountability and investigation. All right, so autonomy and accountability. So the police must remain autonomous and free from the influence of government and the mass media. One of the important things that happened during the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson was that they found that the city was making money and influencing the police by doing their jobs. That is never good because you should have it autonomous, free from influence of the government and mass media. Law enforcement executives should not be forced into decisions because of the mayor or prime minister or the media. It should be the best that is out there for all involved, not just for somebody in administration. All right, oversight. We're going to talk a little bit about oversight. So, I can tell you I'm a big believer that oversight in law enforcement is crucial. There should be accountability, there should be policies and procedures, there should be transparency. I'll give you an example. We used to have a use of force review board that had oversight on it. So whenever an officer used force, that police report would be approved and forwarded to the use of force review board. And then once a month, the use of force review board would meet, and on the board was a defensive tactics instructor, somebody who instructed how to respond to force, a police supervisor, a police officer, a civilian police employee, and then a civilian from the public, not an employee. And those were the minimums because everybody needed to read the report, make sure that the officer followed policy and procedure and the defensive tactics instructions that's used. And if that didn't happen, the board would make recommendations. So this is just one example where it's a really great idea with oversight and transparency to have citizens involved in what is going on with their law enforcement agency. All right, so Brady Decision. That's also, when we're talking about ethics and morality and integrity, very important. It's the Brady versus Maryland decision. And what does that have to do with law enforcement? So I put a overview of the case link below, but something that has to be understood by every law enforcement officer is if an officer lies in any part of the job, and it can be a small white lie, it could be a large lie, it could be any lie. An officer has to have integrity and cannot lie, because if that officer lies, then, and if the department knows about it, the department through Brady is required to notify the defense through the prosecution that, hey, this officer's lied in the past. And if you can imagine, that just takes the credibility of the officer, and the officer has none. So let's say that an officer actually witnessed a murder, and the officer was sitting on the stand, and a jury was listening to the officer, and the defense attorney had been told that the officer had lied on a report. If the jury found out that the officer had lied in the past, how does the jury know that that officer's not lying now? So integrity is huge, and Brady has pretty much made it whenever an officer is accused that they could be lying, they're generally, most agencies will place them on administrative leave, and generally the career will be ended because of the Brady decision. All right, Garrity Warning. This is also huge. So this is another difference that has to do with a police officer's job and why it's so important for them to always be ethically, morally just and have integrity. Because Garrity pretty much says that if a public employee is unionized and a supervisor calls that officer in for questioning, the employee can invoke certain rights to request union representation. And once that begins, there's what's called Garrity, which basically says that if the questioning is not going to be used in a criminal proceeding, the officer has to answer questions. They have rights. Whatever the officer says can't be used against them for disciplinary purposes. But why this is so very important is because if an officer goes to a shooting, the officer can't just say, oh, I messed up and I might get in trouble, I might get disciplined, or I might get a few weeks off, or I might get fired, so I'm not going to say anything. They can't say that because they are acting on the public's interest. They've been certified by the state. And so therefore, when they're called in, and ask questions about what happened, they are compelled to do that. So the employer has to know that they may proceed and discipline on the underlying basis of the investigation, but employee's compelled statement cannot be used against a criminal prosecution of the employee. So Garrity is really important because, again, an officer cannot go in and say, oh, I'm not going to tell you what happened at the shooting because you may get, you may fire me. And Garrity says basically the officer has to answer for what they did because of their position, but it can't be used against them in a criminal proceeding. So that's what's really important with understanding officers and how important it is to be ethically, morally right and have integrity. All right, we're going to really quickly go over the 3 investigation models that are spoke about in your book. The first is the dependent model. So this talks about where police officers investigate allegations against their own members. That's generally an internal affairs division. And the benefits of this model is officers being investigated are easily accessible, it's lower costs, but the criticisms are it's not a lot of transparency. So generally, if you have a officer involved shooting or you have something going on, a lot of times departments will not instigate the dependent model. They will bring in another agency, law enforcement agency, to do the investigation so that everybody knows that, hey, we have transparency, there's a checks and balances, and we're not trying to cover up for anybody. We also have the interdependent model, and that's where investigators investigate allegations against their own members or members of another police department with civilian oversight. And this is kind of what I talked about earlier with the civilian oversight. That this is huge. They're generally called a shoot, don't shoot board. And lots of agencies, my agency's had it, where you have civilian oversight. And it's a very good model to use whether you're investigating your own officers or another agency. And then we have the independent model. This includes a civilian body of investigators that receive complaints and initiate and conduct the complete investigation. So an example of this would be Ferguson, where we had the Michael Brown shooting, and you had the Department of Justice that came in, that was a civilian body of investigators that weren't related to the department at all, to complete their investigation. All right, so now it's your turn. I'm going to bring up a couple what ifs. I want you to begin thinking about them, and over the next couple weeks before we meet, jot down some of your answers because we will be discussing these further. Okay, so first of all, you're a police chief. What would you do? You're a police chief in a small town. One of your recent recruits has been discovered taking kickbacks from a tow truck business for accident referrals. In every other regard, the officer seems to be an excellent employee. The complaint was brought to you by a rival tow truck business, but has now become common knowledge in the department. So what ethical issues are involved in this case? And remember what we've spoken about in the past. And what should you do as a police chief? Okay, next, you're now the mayor. You're the mayor of a major city. The police chief has been quoted as saying that honesty in law enforcement is almost impossible to achieve in today's corrupt environment. The media and others are highly critical of this statement, but he says he was just being truthful and realistic. What is your opinion on this matter, and what actions, if any, would you take? And remember, in a municipality such as Ashland or Medford, in a city police department, the mayor and the city manager and the city council are over the chief. All right, and finally, you're a police officer. You've just apprehended a drug pusher that you've been after for quite some time. It's been a long and arduous case. This pusher is only one step down from the drug distributor, and you know if you can just get him to talk, you will have the distributor too. You know the rules, but you also know of countless lives that have been lost or ruined because of this man and his boss. You and your partner have been interrogating him for hours with nothing to show for it. You are not supposed to be left alone with him, but your partner steps out for coffee. So, do you take it upon yourself to see that he has an incentive to talk? What do you do? What are your reasons? All right, this ends this presentation.